And dare I ask, how was the air conditioning? Fear not. We are in the presence of a mechanical engineer. In fact, he's one of the nicest mechanical engineers I've ever worked with. And coming from a structural engineer, I think that's saying something. That's right. I am referring to our next speaker, who is a technical director at Aurecon, who has spent the last 40 years as a consultant designer, client team member, and a design and construction contractor in building services across Australia and internationally. In terms of heritage, he is a true believer, having spent some years working in Egypt, which is a country that contains some of the wonders of the ancient world. Returned to Adelaide, he took up residence in a heritage-listed hotel, which he had converted into a house. I'm pleased to present to you a passionate advocate for the adaptive reuse of our city's buildings. Do not touch that thermostat, ladies and gentlemen. Here comes Simon Williams.
David. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. David's sort of given my bit of a bio. Why is it not doing what I want? Plan B.
Use this one, mate.
That's right. I'm just getting my timer going because I want to keep myself on time. So as I said, I've spent my career in designing buildings and specifically the engineering components of buildings. Fortunate enough to also have worked overseas for about 18 years of my career in both Bangkok and in Cairo in Egypt. So I also have a deep personal interest in history and culture and heritage, which comes with history and culture. So simple statement, but the heritage of a building is intertwined with its use. So building isn't just an object that sits there and you say, oh, it has heritage, right? A building is a functional thing and it has a use. And to function, a building needs to have services, right? It needs air, ventilation, it needs water for human consumption or for human function. It needs light, relatively new innovation, power, and communications capabilities. So a lot of engineering goes into those elements of any building, and they need to be sustained. But also intertwine in the talk about that intersection between culture and heritage and function, and the importance of understanding the culture and the heritage when you are looking at the function, sustaining it and growing it. So as I said, human use is connected to culture. So when you use a building, the use of that building and how you use it and what you use it for is an expression of your culture. And I'll give some examples of how that works. As I've mentioned, heritage is about aesthetics as well, and something is beautiful, but that beauty is part of its use, in fact. And then finally, and very importantly, heritage has got a lot to tell us about sustainability. Some obvious cases of it in terms of you're sustaining a object with its embedded carbon and its value, you keep that operating for longer periods of time. But also there's heritage buildings tell us a lot about how to build environments that do last for hundreds of years. So there's some important lessons there. In terms of some of the engineering sort of approaches and architects as well, I'm sure have the same thinking. When you're trying to look at a building and sustaining its function, there's some fundamental approaches. Number one is do nothing. And that sounds a bit ironic, but people knew how to build buildings, right? So buildings have been built for thousands of years. They are capable of their function. They have ventilation, even if there's no fans. They have light. They have water. So these things are fundamental. So often you can work with those things and do nothing and live with the outcomes. But sometimes you want to add amenity to a building to add to its function, to allow it to be reused in more modern ways or ways that will extend its lifestyle. So you try to hide things, and I'll give you some examples of that. Another approach is to express things, and Stephen's comment about the reinforcing structure was an interesting one. It's there, you can see it, but it's expressed in a way that's sympathetic with the original heritage structure. Just to note, express doesn't mean fail to hide. Fail to hide doesn't count. And then rebuild. So you can actually take a heritage structure and for various reasons have to radically change it, but you can maintain the heritage elements, both in terms of physical elements, but also in terms of the spirit and the essence of the place or the facility. And I've got some examples of that. So in the do nothing sort of camp, that's a Roman ruin at Ephesus. I wasn't involved in that project before my time, but it just illustrates the fact that people knew how to build buildings. The fundamentals of how buildings get used doesn't really change. I mean, the aesthetics might be a bit different. And one of the key building services is hydraulics or plumbing, as it's more commonly known. And the essence and the fundamental physical properties of plumbing goes back before the Romans, but the Romans made great advances in it. And the technology, the principles, if you look at some of the pipe work, those principles are still there today. And hydraulics is probably much more of an art than a science in so many ways, because it just uses those physical properties and the rules of thumb, if you like, that have been evolved as the craft's evolved. But obviously some structures don't have the ability to have the amenities that you might want in that facility. So those amenities can be tacked on. And I'm sure you've seen examples of this. Churches are a classic where you have the amenity block out the back. So you sometimes have to tack things on to provide the amenity you want. This is an example of hiding stuff. So I was fortunate enough to be working in Thailand. It's also an example of culture. So this was a royal palace that was needing to be upgraded in preparation for the 60th anniversary of the king's ascension to the throne. Now, the Thai people have enormous respect for the royalty, and as the firm I was working for provided free of charge services into that upgrade, because it was all part of that respect and honour shown to the king. So what did we do here? We put in air conditioning. Right, they're all staring at the screen. The beauty of what we do, a lot of it, is nobody can see it, nobody can hear it, nobody can feel it. If we've done a good job, nobody knows it's even there. Right? So can be frustrating sometimes, but that is a great success. So where is it? You'll notice it's a domed or arched ceiling, and if you can't see it, but on the outside of the building it is rectangular. So between the arch and the rectangle there is a triangular space. You could walk around in it very easily. You could put ductwork in it. You could put air conditioning units in there. So all of that happened in behind, up in those void spaces. Again, I talked about do nothing. This building, in fact, was a huge thermal mass, right? So even in a tropical country like Thailand, it actually maintained very stable conditions. The sort of, if you have a diurnal cycle of temperature in a large thermal mass building, the temperature tends to remain at that average constant. So in fact, to air condition it was not by just trickling in a small amount of air conditioning, we're able to maintain quite comfortable conditions so that the people in their fancy uniforms and things wouldn't get too sweaty. Now, obviously it wasn't 22 degrees plus or minus 0.5, which is my point that, we can live with conditions that aren't necessarily what we maybe have to do in a new building. This is another example of hiding. So this was a royal hunting lodge in Egypt. It's now the Mena Palace Hotel, a very nice hotel with obvious views of the pyramids there. So in doing restoration work or adding modern amenities into a building like that, we had to reticulate power, we had to reticulate water, chill water for the cooling and all those sorts of things. Where can we put those sort of amenities running around in a building? You can just see in the background what the facade of the building looks like. Again, the answer here was, you'll see that wooden balustrade. Underneath that's a masonry structure. Within that masonry structure, you wouldn't believe what we managed to squeeze in. So all of that contained a lot of the main power reticulation and water reticulation actually ran along inside, because that was an element that we could touch. It was not original heritage. It was stuff that was being reconstructed as part of the hotel works. The building had been a hotel for many, many years, but it was a restoration of it, and we were trying to bring it back to a more sympathetic arrangement. This is another example, a photo I took from a recent holiday. it was a hospital originally. It was built by the French in Luang Prabang in Laos in the early part of last century. And a hospital, the function needs a lot of natural light. It needs a lot of natural ventilation to create the healing environment that people need to be cured. So you can see it had a long building with lots of doors opening to outside that could be opened up and you can get lots of fresh air and lots of ventilation through the room. Of course, it had been converted to a hotel, lovely hotel, but it does get extremely hot there. So the modern amenity, again, they want some air conditioning. So we engineers, especially mechanical engineers, we tend to walk around like this, looking at the ceiling to see how the vents are looking. And of course, you look up and you see perhaps not the most sympathetic piece of air conditioning design in a heritage building. But again, most people would never notice it, right? It's only we engineers. But again, expressing isn't just failing to hide. I'm sure there'd be a better architectural solution if we tried harder. Light is the other important function we talked about that builds your utility of a building. Obviously, electric light, as Richard pointed out, is a relatively new innovation. Again, the design and implementation of lighting systems is very much an art, and we have to work, our specialists in that space work very closely with architects because it's a very human thing. Our reaction to light makes us feel, threatened by bright, dark, bright, ugly light. It makes us feel peaceful and relaxed by sympathetic light. It very much interacts with us in a human sense. So there is a great deal of cultural understanding and heritage understanding about how to implement lighting schemes in a way that taps into that human sense that we appreciate of life. Slight segue, but just to another project that I was involved in talking about Egypt. This was about 15 years ago, I calculated, that I started working on this project. I left after only a few years on it. I did check the website, it's not finished yet. These things take time. And it was a huge exercise. The Grand Museum of Egypt is one of the largest museums in the world. It has just ridiculously huge amount of artefacts. And the old museum, in fact, the artefacts that had been discovered were then lost in the museum because they all went into the basement. Some of them were literally buried because the weight of the other activities had pushed them back into the ground. So the new museum is under construction. The first stage was to build these facilities for restoring the antiquities and storing them. So the design life for this building was hundreds of years. I can't remember how many hundreds, but it was multiple hundreds of years, the design life of the building we had to construct. So that was a very powerful message in your mind to just think in those terms, because the people who built the buildings hundreds of years ago probably didn't have a design life criteria. But when you do have one, it does really make you think about what you have to do to make a building last for hundreds of years. And that's the sustainability overlay. So how do you preserve antiquities? Well, you bury them, right? So this building was buried under the ground near the pyramids where the new museum was going to be. It didn't need air conditioning. The little ventilation that it had came in through a labyrinth system through the earth to be cooled down. Certain areas did have air conditioning, but that was a general principle. Very little mechanical ventilation and no cooling. There was no water in the main part of the building, because what destroys things and what destroys buildings is water, right? That is a key fact. If you look at any building that starts to decay or degrade, very often it's water that's caused the problem. So the solution was to keep all water out of this building, even for fire protection. Where there was fire protection necessary, they used gaseous systems. This is another little story out of that project. That's a statue of King Ramses II being created through the city of Cairo, and some of the challenges that Mark's described, moving large objects, was obviously part of that. And those of us who've been involved in building projects know you have a building site, you've got the site offices and all the rest of it. We'd go meetings at that site office. The project director's office was sitting on top of a stack. You'd sit in his office for a meeting. Looking in the window was King Ramses II, because they parked his statue temporarily, pending building works, outside his office, looking in the window. So, which brings, it's that link of culture, right? So the culture is the big boss is watching you. That's Egyptian culture today and goes back tens of thousands of years. And it's like, none of those shenanigans. Keep your eye on the ball. Don't play with the money. Looking in the window. Another segue, but I had to throw this one in here. This is in the basement of the Adelaide Railway Station. So heritage itself engineering itself can be a heritage. And some your speakers have been very passionate about that, obviously. But this, literally, I stumbled across it. As some of us have mentioned, to understand a building and to work out how you preserve it, you really have to dig into its bones and understand its history. So the chap who was showing me around the railway station said, "Oh, do you want to look at level sub-basement 1 or whatever it was?" And I said, "I don't see that on my plan, so it doesn't exist." He said, "Yes, it does." So he unlocked a door that said no entry, confined space. I shouldn't say that, but anyway, we went down the stairs. Yeah, Chatham House rules, yeah. Went down the stairs and there was this refrigeration plant from the early 1920s, which was established to provide cooling for the fruit and vegetables and the freight that was going through the railway station. To my knowledge, it's still there, but a coal-fired refrigeration compressor sitting in the basement. My beginnings of my career was actually in what we call building management and control systems. So that's sort of a specialised engineering field for controlling buildings. I was very interested to come across that picture or that thing in a Telstra telephone exchange. And I know Telstra sort of likes to be branded with modern technology, but if you've ever been in a Telstra exchange, you'll see lots of heritage items in there. But the lesson from that is that the need to have a way for an operator to see clearly what was going on in a building, the function that he needed to achieve, was very beautifully expressed in that thing. There's no computers involved. It's just lights and pretty pictures and colours. But that was a tool for someone to do their job in an effective way. Going back to the railway station, that picture was taken an interesting part of time where you can see the original train tracks and the original terminal with the new development happening on top. You can see those, you can probably just see on top of the platforms there's a fan structure and ductwork. Obviously, lots happened since then. Those fans are still there. They've been moved around a bit, but largely they're there, and the ducts are still there. Obviously, it's been modified and changed. Now, the lesson here is about understanding the culture and history of a project. So when this project happened, the rail line said, well, if you're going to build above us, we need to keep operating. You need to provide fans because we need to have it to operate. So the developer on top had the problem of the fans. That was their problem, right? That thinking and mentality is still there today, and those issues are still being unpacked. So if you walked into that situation today and said, why the heck is this happening this way? You have to look back at the history and the understanding of why that situation evolved. Another interesting aspect of the railway station was the plumbing. I love the plumbing. And this is the thing about materials, and interesting to hear the conversation around cast iron. So what we found was that a lot of the original cast iron from the 1920s was actually fine. It's a wonderful material, as Stephen would attest to, and it lasted very, very well. Some of the newer cast iron, or newer materials, but some of it was cast iron, but other alternative materials that went in the 70s and 80s was failing. So, again, that brings us back to that sustainability question. And the choices we make about materials and the design life of materials are vital, because it's water that will kill the building, right? You've got leaking water coming out into the structure, it will destroy it, right? And it's also the hydraulics is an example of something that's deep into the bones of the building. To change it, you're digging up floors, you're ripping down, interior parts of the building that are very hard to deal with otherwise. So a really important message about making those design decisions. I'm going to speed up a bit. Her Majesty's Theatre, you all would have seen this project. Picture on the left is how it was for many, many years. The picture on the right is what it looks like now. Key takeaway, it doesn't look very different, does it? Right? I mean, the heritage neon sign's still the same, all the rest of it. The building on the left, though, you see is being tacked onto it. Again, in that express the change mentality, and I've got to credit the Cox architects for that. And that's where we put the things that wouldn't fit in the main building. It were too hard to fit in, the amenities, the bars, all of those things. The other interesting thing about theatres is, they have a certain form because that's their function, right? So there's the entry foyer, there's the rake seating, there's the stage, which are remarkably large when you actually get on them and see how they work, and there is the backstage. So to make this work as a modern theatre, a lot of things had to happen, right? The seating had to be improved, the staging had to be improved, the backstage area had to be radically changed. So what was kept? Well, that front facade was kept. The eastern facade was kept, as you can see in that grey area, and pretty much everything else went. But what was the choice? So before this project, we were involved in the HMT about 5 or 10 years before that, and it was at the point where it could no longer function. The fire brigade was saying, this is unsafe. You cannot put 1,200 people in this building. It's got wood, it's got no fire protection, it's got lots of things wrong with it. So we did various upgrades to keep it going, but for it to have an economic life, it needed to be relifed in such a way that it could operate. Now, there's probably all sorts of different opinions whether that's the right or wrong thing to do, but it can be done in an empathetic way so that the life and the culture of it is still there. You know, the interiors still look and feel like the interiors, unlike sort of the 1970s overlay that was there before, because it had its original look and feel. It had been changed and modified to a different aesthetic, an aesthetic we probably don't appreciate anymore. And now it's been brought back to that aesthetic. But when you dig around in the bones of the building, you see stuff that, you know, it's a different culture and perhaps not the culture we'd appreciate today. You see that yellow wall, which is you've probably read about, but that had signatures from performers over many, many decades. So that wall was actually removed brick by brick and reinstated into the green room because it had all that heritage and feeling to it. So as far as the theatre people are concerned, they recognise it's not the HMT that was built in 1900, whatever it was, but they still feel that it is what it is because it still has that culture, it still has that function, it still has that feeling to it. This is another example from Adelaide Festival Centre, where again you see why a theatre looks like it does and what the shape of it's like. And from an engineering point of view, you know, physically going down to the bowels of the building, opening up the plan drawer and ruffling through all the drawings to find these hand-drawn 1970s drawings was a fascinating and interesting and important experience. You actually have to do that to understand how the building worked so that you can sustain it. Again, a bit of building management system there, which is always good to see. While I was doing that project, I was fortunate enough to be travelling in Palermo in Italy. We went to the Opera Theatre, a magnificent building. You'll just see at the top there, those segments in the roof. Originally, and unfortunately still doesn't work, they would open up. So you could actually open that roof and you would get natural ventilation through the building. So again, they knew how to build buildings in the 1800s and earlier. And, you know, buildings didn't have air conditioning. And I'm an air conditioning engineer, but I always promote not having it if you can avoid it. The other story with that is the fire protection, which consisted of Italian firemen standing on every level at the fire exit, because you can see the egress arrangements are a little bit. Sorry, the egress arrangements are a bit ordinary, but that was their solution, right? They had firemen there when there was a big event. So they don't know how to pay the firemen. Maybe the firemen liked opera, I don't know, but that's how it worked. How am I going for time? Am I going well? Okay, good. Thanks, David. The time has stopped working. So I'd like to finish off with this project, which is the REPAT Health Precinct. So a lot of you would know it or heard of it. It started its life in the 1940s. And, you know, we look the war in Ukraine and we understand how terrible war is and the like, but it's very hard to imagine what it would have been like living in Australia when our country was at war and our folk were heading off to war. And so the government said we need to repatriate these soldiers. That's the term. When they come back home, we have to take care of them. They have mental and physical damage from being at war, and it's an obligation to do it. So as an emergency crisis response, they built these repatriation hospitals all around Australia, one of which was at Thorpe Park. And it had the bomb shelters. Allegedly, there's an underground theatre there. We've dug up pretty much every square metre of the site. We haven't found it, so it may be a myth. You see the building down at the bottom left there. That was the sort of the Army Standard Ward Block Type A. and they rolled out many of them. But you can see it has that characteristic form to it. Beautiful sunroom at the end, the purpose of natural light, lovely natural ventilation along the sides, well-designed purpose-built building. Over the years, as you know the story, it became the idea to shut it down. And you remember the protest from the people who had such a strong connection to that building or that site. And again, it's that cultural and heritage connection, because to them it was a place of healing that they had a very strong connection to. So the project has been doing a lot of work there, and it's brought it back to a stage now where it is still providing similar services, which I'll describe a bit more. Interesting enough, I came across that photo in my mother's photo album of her time working at that facility in the 1940s as a young nurse. And, you know, that photo was actually useful for the architects to show what it looked like back then. So that picture is, you know, the steam system. So it was a central hospital system. It had all the central utilities. That's what the site looked like at the time. Again, physically touching and feeling those drawings as part of research, and necessary research, not just historical interest, but actually needing to understand things. Seeing those drawings from the 40s was amazing. This was how the site was about 5 years ago, or a little bit more. You can see that the original form had been damaged, right? Lots and lots of more buildings had been thrown on the site. Lots of things had happened. It did lose a lot of that heritage identity. And it did get to the point where the government's saying it's unsustainable as a precinct, the infrastructure, etc. And as an engineer, you'd put your hand up and say, yep, cost a fortune to fix this, doesn't make any sense, right? But because of that protest we talk about, that had to be rethought, and it's been reborn as what's now called health precinct, right? So rather than having all those central services and central facilities of a hospital site, it's now individual health services, each with their own independent identity, but all linked together by those themes of repatriation, physical rehabilitation, mental health. All of those themes are still there. Obviously, I said, you know, from the services point of view, we had to, you know, have a look at what was there, the mess that was created over the years, and then turn that into something logical. So that's kind of the engineering part of it. But that work had to be informed about A, the old heritage of how it was built, and B, what was the cultural necessity and why was this thing being set up? And always reminding ourselves that we're dealing with, you know, people, young men, unfortunately, brain and spinal injury, which is one of the key wards on site. The key cohort is young men, because they're often the people who have those sorts of injuries. And they're very similar type people in my mind as some of the people who were in there in the 40s. There's that characteristic shape building with some lovely air conditioning plant from the 1970s stuck on top, which destroys it. So that's some of the things we had to sort of try and strip back and deal with. I was interested to see our Scottish friend talk about finding an HV cable on South Georgia Island. You'd be amazed where you find HV cables. That's HV cables going through the middle of a building, which is not what you'd normally expect to find. It's a fire panel in a ceiling, which is not what you'd expect to find, etc., etc. The Patrick Fund Hall, funded by school children donations in the 40s. So it's really powerful to see that. And there it is with all its steam pipe and heritage engineering sitting in front of it. And there it is after we've stripped all that back. We still managed to get some air conditioning into that crammed plant room. People need to have air conditioning. We sized it based on what's the biggest thing we could put in there, and that'll do. The interior space with its 1970s overlay, which we all love, which now has a much more sympathetic and desirable location. More engineering stuff that I won't talk about. Communications, you know, it's still there from back in the day. But the fundamental outcome was a space that has maintained its heritage. So on the 11th of the 11th last year, it was the 50th anniversary of something. Can't remember its founding. Oh, it probably was its founding, yes. And it was also sort of a milestone on the project. So we had the usual ceremonials. You had the last post, you had the bagpipes played by the architect of the project. You had the RAF flyover, you had the minister's speech, you had the prayers, all those things. And of course you had the Indigenous Welcome to Country ceremony. And the guy who gave that speech, I thought really turned things around in an interesting way, because he talked about Aboriginals' connection to land. We've heard that many times and we understand it, and well, we hope to understand it, and we appreciate it. But he actually then flipped it around and said, this is your people, your families' connection to this piece of land, because it's, and there was all sorts of people there. There was Vietnam vets, there was all sorts of people, and people had dedicated their lives medically to these sorts of facilities. He said, this is your place, this is your connection to your land. And I was pleased to have been a part of restoring that and bringing it back to life. So that's about that connection piece. And I'll leave it at that, David. Thank you.
But don't run away. There's always questions.
Yes.
There were a lot of questions in the last session. So if anyone didn't get a question, and now's your chance to talk. Look, I'll go straight to the elephant in the room. The fella in the colourful shirt in the photo, is it?
No, that's before my time. I had a powder blue suit.
Okay.
That was handed down to me. My brother had to squeeze into for my grandmother's funeral.
Confessions.
No.
But sorry.
It could have been actually. Yes.
No, I love your sustainability angle, and the way you talked about design life. That's something that's been on my mind for a long time, and I sympathise with water being the fundamental enemy as a structural engineer. That's definitely what we deal with the most. And taking the image of the fashion a little bit further, can you reflect on kind of the fast fashion approach to the way we treat our buildings, the way we design our buildings? Do you have any reflections on that as a building designer?
Yes, I'm quite passionate about it, really. You look at some of the design decisions people make, and it's value management, but so much of that is short-term thinking, and it's just the nature of the way accounting works and the way some project development works. But it is tragic because you see, like the example I gave about the plumbing materials. We've got PVC these days, and we're hoping that PVC will last. It seems to be good, but as I think it was Zhu Enlai said about the French Revolution, it's a bit early to tell if it's the right decision or not. Because that's the sort of time frames we're working on. But even within that, having those value management decisions being made with a true understanding of value, I think is a really important point, and go on forever about it. But
do you see a change coming though, like with the sustainable design angle or lens? Are people starting to question those decisions?
I hope and pray. But I think there's some fundamental aspects to it that need to change. A slight segue, but as I said, start off in building engineering, building services or building management systems, and they're all about saving energy. So you go out to customers and say, we can save energy if you put this thing on the wall. That's fine. And what's the payback? I pay this much. How much energy do I charge? So if you want to save energy, what cost of power, which sounds like it's a heretical thing to say. But there's a similar argument also to trying to do a life cycle analysis. You have to start changing the economic thinking, right? So that the OPEX and the CAPEX are truly treated equally. So I think there's some fundamental accounting and economic change has to drive it. There is sort of what I call the marketing approach, which is to promote the idea of sustainability, and that's important. There's a legislative approach, thou shalt make sure that these things have these lifespans. But I think the economic approach is really what's going to drive things, because economics generally does.
Thanks for your answer. Any other questions? If there's no further questions, sorry, there's one.
Yeah, just make a comment, picking up on Her Majesty's Theatre. The people who built that originally ran what was the theatre down here. And after it was White's Assembly Rooms and it became the Bijou Theatre, that had one of those opening rooms for ventilation, as you mentioned in La Paloma.
Thank you.
So all these connections.
Everything comes around, doesn't it?
Great. Well, if you could show your appreciation for Simon, and thank you very much. Okay. Well,